All right, welcome in everyone, and a huge thanks as always to you, the learner, for sending in this fascinating text for us to unpack.
Absolutely. It's always exciting to dive into something new and see where it leads us.
And this one, well, it's a classic for sure.
Huh?
We're tackling El Arte de Ser Feliz by Arthur Schopenhauer. And the learner, your big question here is all about understanding his core philosophy, right?
Right.
How to actually apply his ideas to, well, live a better life.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Everyone's looking for that secret formula for happiness.
Exactly. So our mission today, think of us as your guides, is to break down Schopenhauer's work. We'll extract those golden nuggets of wisdom without getting lost in the sometimes dense philosophical jargon.
We'll try to keep it clear, concise, and most importantly, relevant to your everyday life.
All right, so Schopenhauer structures his advice into two main sections. First, he looks at how we conduct ourselves, our inner world, so to speak.
And then he moves outward, examining how we interact with others, navigating the complexities of human relationships.
But, and this is really important, he lays a foundation first. He outlines what he believes are the essential components of, well, attainable human happiness.
He talks about things like maintaining a cheerful disposition, prioritizing good health, cultivating that sense of inner peace, what he calls tranquility of spirit, and then finally, the role of external goods.
And when he talks about these external goods, he's actually echoing a lot of ancient wisdom, particularly from Epicurus, who categorized our needs and desires as natural and necessary.
Yeah.
Natural but unnecessary, and neither natural nor necessary. It's a really fascinating framework for understanding what we actually need versus what we merely want.
It is, and it sets the stage for Schopenhauer's, well, somewhat unconventional view of happiness. Right from the get-go, he states, quite directly, that perfect, positive happiness, that state of pure bliss we often imagine, is in fact an impossibility.
Okay, hold on, back up a second. Impossible happiness. That's not exactly the most uplifting way to start our deep dive.
No, not exactly, but bear with him. He's not trying to be a downer. It's more about setting realistic expectations. His argument is that rather than chasing this fleeting, perhaps even imaginary ideal of perfect happiness, we should aim for something more achievable, a life with comparatively less pain and suffering.
So it's less about reaching some euphoric peak and more about skillfully navigating those inevitable valleys of life.
Precisely. And this is where the ancient Stoic concept of ta ephemen comes in. It's the idea of focusing on what's within our control. Now, Schopenhauer doesn't adhere strictly to Stoicism, but he acknowledges that while we can't always control external events, we have a significant degree of influence over our internal landscape. Our desires, our expectations, our reactions, those are the things we can and should learn to manage effectively.
So he's basically saying that minimizing suffering starts with mastering our inner world.
Exactly. And that leads us to those rules for how we should conduct ourselves. His very first rule is, well, rather blunt. Accept reality. He argues that we enter the world with all these grand aspirations, yearning for happiness, believing that we can somehow possess and hold on to it permanently. But life has a way of teaching us that nothing is truly ours to keep, that suffering is an unavoidable reality, while happiness is often a fleeting illusion.
Like he's ripping the rose-colored glasses right off our faces, isn't it?
In a way, yes. But remember, his aim is to guide us toward a more sustainable kind of well-being. And that starts with acknowledging the truth, however uncomfortable it might be. He argues that the truly wise individual doesn't chase after that elusive, perhaps even imaginary, perfect happiness. Instead, they learn to appreciate the absence of pain, finding contentment in those moments when suffering is not actively present.
So it's a shift in focus then, not about achieving some ecstatic high, but about skillfully avoiding those low points, those moments of distress.
Precisely. And here he even echoes a quote often attributed to Aristotle. The prudent person pursues not pleasure, but the absence of pain. So for you, the learner, the first key takeaway here is to reorient your primary focus. Instead of constantly pursuing positive joy, which might be an unattainable goal, concentrate on skillfully avoiding suffering. Learn to appreciate the present moment, to find contentment in the absence of current pain, for those are the moments we can truly grasp.
All right, so accept reality, acknowledge the inevitability of suffering, and appreciate the moments free from pain. That's a pretty solid foundation, even if it's not the most cheerful message. But what's next?
Well, building on that acceptance of reality, he suggests we need to become much more mindful of the present moment because really it's the only thing we can be absolutely certain of. Why constantly chase an uncertain future burdened by anxieties when the here and now is what we actually have?
It has a very almost meditative quality to it, doesn't it? This grounding in the present.
It does, and it aligns with a lot of modern psychological thought as well. He's not advocating for a reckless, hedonistic pursuit of every fleeting pleasure. It's more about a conscious appreciation for the absence of suffering in this very moment. It's a subtle but powerful distinction.
Okay, so first, we ground ourselves in reality, accepting its inherent nature. Then we focus on the present moment, finding contentment in the absence of current suffering. What's the next step on this path toward a less painful existence?
Well, his rule number 2 is something we hear a lot but often struggle to put into practice. He says, avoid envy.
Now, that one's a tough one. It's so easy to get caught up in comparing ourselves to others, especially in today's world with social media constantly showcasing everyone's, well, supposedly perfect lives.
It is. And Schopenhauer knew this, even back in his time. He was a keen observer of human nature, and he recognized the corrosive power of envy. He actually quotes Seneca on this, saying, "Never will you be happy if you torment yourself that someone else is happier." But then he takes it even further with this really sharp observation. There is nothing more implacable and cruel than envy, and yet we strive incessantly and principally to arouse envy. He's basically saying that often our actions are driven by a desire for external validation rather than genuine inner contentment. We seek to impress others, to elicit their envy, mistaking that for a measure of our own worth.
Ouch. That's a harsh truth, but I think there's a lot of validity to it.
There is. Think about how much energy we expend trying to project a certain image, to appear successful or happy to the outside world. Schopenhauer would argue that this is a futile effort. True contentment comes from within, from accepting ourselves as we are with all our flaws and limitations. So his advice is to actively counter that envy by considering those who have less than us, not just those who seem to have more.
Okay, so accept reality, be present, and avoid envy. Sounds like a good recipe for inner peace. What else does he have in store for us on this path toward, well, let's call it less painful existence?
All right, well, his rule number 3 delves into the concept of character. He argues that we have 3 distinct layers to our character. First, there's our innate character, what we're born with, the raw material, so to speak.
Okay, so that's our genetic predisposition, our inherent tendencies, the things that make us, well, us.
Right. Then there's our manifested character, how those innate qualities are expressed in our actions, our behaviors, how the world sees us. But then he introduces this fascinating idea of an acquired character, something that develops through our experiences, through our interactions with the world.
So it's like our innate character is the seed, our manifested character is the plant that grows from it, and then our acquired character is how we prune and shape that plant based on the environment and our choices.
That's a great analogy. And Schopenhauer would say that we don't always understand ourselves fully at first. Even our rational thinking can sometimes mislead us about what we truly want and what we're actually good at.
So it's about learning through experience what really aligns with our true nature.
Exactly. And he even uses Hobbes's social contract as an analogy. To gain something specific, to have exclusive rights, you have to renounce other claims. Similarly, in life, to achieve genuine contentment, we need to focus our energies on what aligns with our true capabilities and desires. We can't be everything, and trying to be often leads to frustration and regret. He really emphasizes that self-knowledge is key. Knowing your strengths, accepting your limitations, and pursuing goals that are in harmony with your authentic self.
Okay, so that's a pretty profound idea. It's not enough to just understand our innate tendencies, how we naturally are. We need to cultivate self-awareness through experience, learning what we truly want, what we excel at, and what we're better off letting go of.
Right. And Schopenhauer really believed that this kind of self-knowledge is a crucial step in minimizing suffering. Because when we try to force ourselves into molds that don't fit, when we chase after things that are not truly aligned with our nature, that's when we create a lot of internal conflict and dissatisfaction.
Makes sense. Okay, so accept reality, be present, avoid envy, and know thyself. These are some pretty powerful rules for life. What else can we glean from Schopenhauer's wisdom?
All right, well, his rule number 4 really struck a chord with me. It's about the relationship between our claims, what we expect or demand from life, and our possessions. And he makes this bold statement. We don't even miss what we never thought was possible.
That's interesting. So it's not just about what we have, but also about what we believe we're entitled to have.
Exactly. Our expectations define the scope of our potential happiness or unhappiness. He uses this really powerful metaphor. Wealth is like seawater. The more you drink, the thirstier you become.
So it's not about the absolute quantity of what we possess, but rather how that quantity relates to our desires, our expectations.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is that our expectations can shift. When we experience loss, we tend to adjust our expectations downwards, and eventually the pain subsides. Conversely, when we experience good fortune, our expectations tend to rise, and the initial joy we feel fades as we adapt to this new normal.
It's like that hedonic treadmill, isn't it? We're always striving for more, never quite reaching a state of lasting satisfaction.
Precisely. And Schopenhauer would say that this constant striving is a major source of suffering. So his advice here for you, the learner, is to manage your desires and expectations. Keep your claims in check. Don't let those desires run rampant, always demanding more, because ultimately, contentment comes not from amassing possessions, but from finding peace with what you have.
So it's about recognizing that happiness isn't a destination, a point we reach when we finally acquire enough things. It's more about an internal state of being, a way of relating to the world and to our own desires.
Exactly. It's a perspective shift, from constantly striving for more to finding contentment in the present moment, in the simple act of being.
Now, his rule number 5 is a little bit more philosophical. It's about what he calls the natural and individual measure of pain. And it's a bit of a head-scratcher. He suggests that maybe each of us has a certain, almost predetermined capacity for experiencing pain.
This one is a bit complex, but it offers a really unique perspective. He suggests that our baseline level of felt pain, regardless of the specific sources of that pain, might actually be relatively constant. What changes is our perception of it.
So it's like our individual pain threshold. Some people just seem to experience things more intensely than others.
Yes, but he takes it a step further. He argues that major life crises, while intensely painful in the moment, might not actually alter our overall level of suffering in the long run. Once that initial shock subsides, we tend to revert back to our baseline. And conversely, those long-awaited joys, those moments of intense happiness, might not result in a sustained increase in our overall well-being. They too fade, and we return to our normal state.
So what's the takeaway here? If our capacity for suffering is somewhat fixed, does that mean we're just doomed to a certain level of unhappiness?
Not necessarily. The key insight here, the learner, is that perhaps the focus shouldn't be on eliminating specific sources of pain, which might be an impossible task, but rather on cultivating an inner resilience to the reality of suffering. Schopenhauer observed that intense joy and intense pain often go hand in hand, particularly in those with lively, passionate personalities, and he argued that both are often rooted in our anticipation of the future rather than our experience of the present moment.
So back to that emphasis on being present.
Right.
But how do we actually cultivate this inner resilience?
Well, he has some specific advice for that. He cautions against excessive joy, arguing that it's often based on this illusion that we finally found lasting satisfaction. We get caught up in the excitement of a new achievement, a new possession, a new relationship, believing that it will finally bring us that elusive happiness. But inevitably, the excitement fades, the novelty wears off, and we're left with that familiar feeling of emptiness, of longing for something more.
So those highs and lows we experience are often just part of this natural cycle. And by chasing those highs, we're actually setting ourselves up for the inevitable crashes.
Exactly. And Schopenhauer believed that this pursuit of excessive joy is a form of self-deception. It prevents us from seeing things clearly, from accepting the reality of suffering as a fundamental part of the human condition. And instead of seeking external sources for our pain, blaming specific events or circumstances, he encourages us to turn inward, to recognize that the root of our suffering might lie in our own nature, in our relentless desires and our inability to find true satisfaction in anything outside of ourselves.
Okay, so rule number 5 is definitely a lot to unpack. But the core message seems to be that we need to become more aware of our own internal landscape, of those desires and expectations that are constantly driving us. And perhaps, by accepting the reality of suffering, we can begin to cultivate a sense of inner peace, a resilience that allows us to navigate those inevitable ups and downs with more grace and equanimity.
Precisely. It's not about denying the pain or pretending it doesn't exist. It's about finding a way to relate to it differently, to not let it completely define our experience of life.
So after all that somewhat heavy contemplation about the nature of suffering, I think we're ready for a bit of a lighter note.
All right, well, Schopenhauer does offer some more uplifting advice as well. His rule number 13 is all about embracing cheerfulness. He says, don't question whether you deserve to be cheerful, simply allow it. And he even calls cheerfulness its own reward, something that can compensate for a multitude of other shortcomings.
So he's saying that cheerfulness isn't something we earn or deserve. It's a choice we make, a perspective we adopt.
Exactly. And he believes that a cheerful person is fundamentally happier, regardless of their external circumstances. It's like an inner light that shines through, illuminating even the darkest of times.
And how do we cultivate this inner light, this sense of cheerfulness?
Well, he emphasizes the importance of good health. He says that without health, all other pursuits are meaningless. He famously stated that a healthy beggar is far happier than a sick king.
It makes sense, doesn't it? When we're feeling physically well, it's so much easier to maintain a positive outlook on life.
It is. And he also recommends avoiding excesses, intense emotional swings, and constant mental overexertion. He believed in a holistic approach to well-being, recognizing the interconnectedness of our physical, mental, and emotional states.
So eat well, exercise regularly, get enough sleep, manage stress, and avoid those things that deplete your energy and vitality. Sounds like pretty solid advice.
It is, and it highlights the fact that cheerfulness isn't just about forcing a smile or pretending everything is fine. It's about creating the conditions within ourselves that allow for genuine joy and contentment to arise naturally.
Okay, so cultivate cheerfulness. Prioritize your health, both physically and mentally. These are great tips. But what about those times when, no matter how healthy and cheerful we are, life just throws us a curveball? How do we deal with the inevitable challenges and setbacks?
Well, his rule number 14 offers some guidance for that. He talks about the importance of balancing our attention between the present and the future. He says wisdom lies in not letting either one dominate to the detriment of the other.
So not getting so caught up in the present that we neglect to plan for the future, but also not getting so consumed by future worries that we miss out on the beauty and joy of the present moment.
Precisely. He observed that some people live too much in the moment, being reckless and impulsive, while others are so focused on future ambitions or anxieties that they never fully experience the present. He argues that those who are solely fixated on future goals often end up postponing their lives, always waiting for that perfect moment that never arrives.
And those who dwell excessively on potential future misfortunes, well, they just rob themselves of any present peace.
Exactly. So his advice here is to find that balance, to appreciate the present without being imprudent, and to plan for the future without succumbing to paralyzing worry.
Easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
But it's about finding that sweet spot, that middle path where we're neither carelessly drifting through life nor burdened by excessive anxieties.
Right. And he offers a very practical suggestion for dealing with those inevitable future worries. He says, train yourself to view uncertain evils as unlikely to occur. And when faced with those inevitable but indefinite events, like, well, death, for example, don't dwell on them excessively.
So it's about focusing our energy on what we can control, on the things we can actually do something about, and letting go of those things that are outside of our sphere of influence.
Exactly. It's a very pragmatic approach to managing anxiety and worry.
Okay, so cultivate cheerfulness. Prioritize your health. Find that balance between the present and the future, and manage your worries effectively. These are some really valuable tools for navigating life's challenges, but I'm still grappling with that initial statement about perfect happiness being impossible. Feels a bit, well, pessimistic.
I understand. It's a challenging concept to embrace. But Schopenhauer's rule number 22 really brings his entire argument full circle. He states that the term living happily is almost an overstatement. What we should really aim for is living with as little unhappiness as possible, or at least tolerably.
So he's basically saying that true happiness isn't about reaching some ecstatic state of perpetual bliss. It's more about minimizing suffering, about finding a way to live with the inevitable pains and disappointments of life without letting them completely overwhelm us.
Precisely. And he believes that the young, in particular, are often misled by romantic notions and superficial appearances into thinking that life is primarily for enjoyment. They chase after those fleeting pleasures, believing that they will ultimately lead to lasting happiness. But as we've discussed, that pursuit often ends in disappointment, even suffering.
So it's about letting go of those unrealistic expectations, those fairy tale notions of what happiness should look like.
Exactly. And this is where Schopenhauer's negative definition of happiness comes in. He argues that true happiness isn't about experiencing constant joy and pleasure. It's about the absence of pain, the absence of suffering.
So it's a more grounded, perhaps even more realistic perspective on what it means to live a good life.
It is, and it requires a fundamental shift in our thinking. It's about recognizing that suffering is an inherent part of the human condition. We can't escape it entirely. But we can learn to manage it, to minimize its impact on our overall well-being.
Mhm.
And that, for Schopenhauer, is the true path to a fulfilling life.
So the key takeaway here, for you, the learner, is to reorient your understanding of happiness. It's not about constantly chasing after those fleeting moments of pleasure and excitement. It's about finding peace and contentment in the absence of suffering, in the simple act of being.
And finally, to really drive home the importance of this perspective shift, Schopenhauer emphasizes in his rule number 32 the supreme importance of good health. He states that a staggering 9/10 of our happiness depends on it.
9/10, that's a bold claim.
It is, but it reflects his deep understanding of the interconnectedness of our physical and mental well-being. He argues that with good health, even the most unfavorable external circumstances become more bearable. And without health, any amount of wealth, success, or pleasure feels hollow and unsatisfying. He reminds us that a healthy beggar is far happier than a sick king.
So the ultimate lesson here, the learner, is to prioritize your health above all else. Above wealth, knowledge, fame, or fleeting pleasures. It's the foundation upon which all other forms of well-being rest.
Exactly. It's about taking care of your body and your mind, creating the conditions for a naturally joyful and resilient state of being.
So, the learner, as you can see, Schopenhauer's philosophy, while perhaps a bit daunting at first, offers a really practical, albeit somewhat sobering perspective on what it truly means to be happy. It's not about achieving some state of perpetual bliss. It's about minimizing suffering, mastering our inner world, and appreciating those moments of peace and contentment that arise when we're not actively in pain.
He encourages us to really know ourselves, to manage our expectations and desires, to prioritize those inner states of health and tranquility over the constant pursuit of external validation. And I think the idea that cultivating cheerfulness, choosing to approach life with a positive disposition, is a particularly empowering and actionable insight.
It is, and we really hope this exploration of Schopenhauer's key ideas from El Arte de Ser Feliz has given you some valuable food for thought. It certainly raises some important questions, doesn't it? How does this more realistic, perhaps even somewhat pessimistic view of happiness resonate with your own lived experience? Does the idea of focusing on minimizing pain feel like a practical, maybe even liberating path toward a more fulfilling life? And what are the broader implications of accepting that this elusive positive happiness might actually be more of an illusion than a tangible goal?
It's a perspective that challenges us to re-examine our priorities, to question those societal narratives that often equate happiness with material wealth, external achievements, and the constant pursuit of pleasure.
It is, and it invites us to cultivate a deeper sense of self-awareness, to find contentment in the simple act of being, and to embrace the present moment with all its imperfections as the only true reality we have. This is really just the beginning of a much deeper exploration, and we encourage you to revisit Schopenhauer's original work and continue your own personal deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing this fascinating text with us, the learner.
Indeed. It leaves us contemplating a fundamental shift in perspective. If the absence of suffering is the closest we can get to genuine happiness, how does that alter the way we approach life, the choices we make, and the values we prioritize? It's a challenging but ultimately a very thought-provoking viewpoint to consider.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder these profound questions. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
And remember, the learner, the path to a more fulfilling life, might not lie in chasing after some elusive ideal of happiness, but in finding peace within the reality of our human experience.